in office, and on the opposite end of the spectrum, the idea that this person has nothing to do with government and government just stinks, and so this person must, by dint of that, be bound to do a better job than anyone who has had any association with it. So it still plays out, and I hadn't thought about that idea because, really, I think the reaction of that one scholar that you mentioned is right, because the engagement really is the education that by being involved in the system and participating in it and becoming familiar with it. I mean, that's really what you need in order to make it work, is to know the process, to be a part of it, and that's when democracy works the best. And if you don't have that one way or another, regardless of what you call it, for all practical matters, you're essentially talking about an oligarchy because the people who participate are going to be the people who run it. And if there aren't enough people doing that, or not enough people allowed to do that, then call it what you will. You might say you're a democracy or a republic or whatever, but it amounts to an oligarchy if only a few people are engaged in that process. So that's what I find fascinating about what you're saying.
Well, that's great. Thank you. So based on that, you're not going to like what I say next about Plato.
Okay, fair enough. No, that's fine.
Yeah. So, and this is a kind of interesting challenge. So in my book of Rule and Office, I lay out, especially, I think, a new and distinctive reading of Plato's, one of his most famous works, which is we call the Republic, in Greek. Actually, the Greek title is Politeia, which means constitution, which is interesting in itself. But and he wrote at least two other really important works, one called The Statesman and one called The Laws, and maybe we can come on to those later. But let me focus for now on the Republic, because that gives an interesting contrast to what you were just saying. So Plato's Republic, here's the received wisdom on the Republic, and then I'll in a moment come to kind of how I want to challenge that. So the received view of the Republic, at least one view that's been influential, is that this is the rule of philosopher kings and philosopher queens. So Plato does make an argument for the equality of women rulers in this dialogue, which is interesting in itself. But the sort of received view is, here he wants to reject democracy. He wants a kind of technocratic rule by a few elite experts. Right. And those experts are going to be untrammeled in the powers that they have. Right. So those questions about term limits, accountability, all those, terms of office, all those things that we were talking about before, Plato this is the general view, wants to throw them out the window and just empower these absolute rulers who, ex hypothesi, have this knowledge of the good and have this special political knowledge. And then the critique of that is exactly what you were saying. Isn't this just oligarchy by another name? Why should we trust these people? So my reading of the Republic and of Rule and Office is actually very different, because I notice that actually Plato is using the vocabulary that his ancient Greek contemporaries used to distinguish any kind of rule from a political office, in the sense of being bounded, being accountable, having term limits, having rotation, having limited powers, all those things, being scrutinized before you take it up. All that is kind of part of his vocabulary when he's talking about these philosopher rulers, these philosopher kings and queens. And he also has a kind of testing for who is really qualified to be in this. So none of these cohorts get to be self-certifying. They actually have to be tested by the people who come before them. And then the other big piece of it is sort of, what does he really mean by this specialized knowledge? And I argue that also we see explicitly in his language, it's about caring about what's good for the society. So the knowledge is not just a technocratic knowledge, it's actually being oriented appropriately and tested to make sure that in practice and experience, as someone who might be entrusted with government, you are going to demonstrate that kind of care. So there's a lot more to say about the details. There's even wages involved for these rulers, which I think is a really interesting point that we should talk about. But the sort of big picture story that I want to give is Plato is building this picture up out of the vocabulary and the practices of accountability and care.
Right.
And he does reconfigure them. He is, kind of taking them farther than they were at the time, but he's not turning his back on accountability. He's actually
Right.
trying to make it more real, to make it apply more fully.
Let me ask you a follow-up question about digging a little bit more into the specifics of what he meant by this series of tests, because it really seems to me that one of the things that we have learned as Americans, or should have learned as Americans, from the last several years is that you can have all the rules and laws and parts of the Constitution that you want, but if you don't have people who are dedicated to the idea that this should work this way, who, as you like essentially say, who care about it being a democracy and functioning as a democracy, as opposed to like just gaining the rules to serve themselves, then it does not function. And I'm wondering, did Plato have a specific set of tests or a specific way that he proposed that would function so that you could, filter out people who were just going to be self-serving, and a way of determining like how much you actually cared about how much a democracy functioned?
Yeah, so he does have specific tests, but
Huh.
let me just underline, I think, the
Sure.
importance of your point, because in a way that's a perfect encapsulation of what I argue in Of Rule and Office. Exactly that I think Plato is giving us these two messages at the same time. So one of them is we actually can beef up our accountability mechanisms even more than we now have. And I think that's part of what he's saying. We need better laws and stronger curbs on the potential for corruption in politics. And I can talk more about some of how that's supposed to
Yeah.
work, which this idea of wages is a certain way of applying wages is part of that. So I think on the one hand, he wants to really strengthen those rules. But then on the other hand, he exactly wants to say what you said, which is, exactly, if you don't have the people who actually care in the right way
Right.
about what those rules are supposed to achieve, any rules can be undermined, any rules can be subverted. No
Right.
purely procedural fix is going to be enough. And I think both sides of that message are really important, and I think
Yeah.
we tend to only want to hear one side or the other. And actually, kind of as a general rule, you might say people on the left want to strengthen the institutions and people on the right want to strengthen virtue. And I think Plato is actually telling us, civic virtue. I think Plato is telling us we actually need to do both. You can't do one without the other.
Yeah,
In that.
it's interesting. Like it's an interplay of both. I think you have to have, because I mean you need structure. You like in order to have a functioning body, you need bones, but you also need muscles in order to carry everything out, and you need things that are that are very tangible and things that are intangible and a little bit more flexible and fungible in order to make the actual day-to-day processes work. And I'm just fascinated by the idea that Plato had an idea of how to like deal with this more intangible side. So if you could do go in a little bit in more detail about what he thought the rules were for getting at and finding members of this technocracy. Not that I necessarily agree with his overall idea of having a techno. I don't necessarily think that would work, but I think it's a fascinating part of this is finding people who would truly care about the system. How did he propose to do that, and what sort of wage structure are you talking about here? That really interests me.
Yeah, great. Well, let me talk about the tests first,
Sure,
and then we'll come
please.
back to the wages.
Sure.
So the tests, it's actually very interesting. He sets out this whole set of tests that should be performed on candidates from the age of 20 all the way until the age of 50. And the people who are older than them, so the older age cohort at each point is doing the tests. So the people who've successfully done it before them.
Okay.
And what's really interesting to me about it is that he thinks even to kind of get into that candidate pool, it's crucial that you not only have intellectual capacities, but you also have to have the kind of proto virtues. You have to
Right.
be not tempted or motivated excessively by the kind of bodily appetites that you might then want to get money to be able
Right.
to fulfill, right? You have to have kind of so it's like he's looking, you have to have a good memory, you have
Right.
to be kind of reliable. So it's very interesting. He has a much more than technocratic picture of what this is. And it includes this being oriented appropriately to caring about the good of those you're ruling
Hmm.
and not being tempted or even having the possibility of being tempted by certain kinds of things that could corrupt you. So
Right.
that's where we'll come back to the wages in a minute. And then the thought is that you go through these different things in sort of 5 or 10 year kind of cycles. So again, there's something akin to term limits here. So you have an education
Right.
where all of this is tested. Those who make it through that education then spend 15 years. And what Socrates, who's the character speaking in the Republic, calls going back into the cave. That's another famous image from
Right.
the Republic.
Right.
And in this case, he's using it kind of metaphorically. You have to go back into the city and actually spend 15 years ruling. And then you're tested in how you perform in practice.
Hmm.
So again, I think what's interesting about this, it's not just sitting the SAT. It's
Right.
not just
Right.
an intellectual test. It's actually about, do you display the right dispositions? Do you care in the right ways and not in the wrong ways? Did you
Right.
use power appropriately? And only then do you go back into the education for a final stage. And then you sort of get to be at the absolute top. And what I think is interesting is that language of office
Hmm.
is explicitly used for these people, the 15 years between 35 and 50, when they're actually doing the ruling back in the city. Those are the office holders. And then the people above them, who I call the complete guardians or the senior guardians, they're the ones, their job is not to be absolutist rulers. Their job is to kind of oversee this education and testing
Right.
of
Right.
people who are actually holding office. So that's again where I think Plato's really accepting in a large way. There are caveat, there are, things one has to say, objections and caveats to this, but he's accepting a large part of the thought that we want temporally bounded office holding.
Right.
That's what good government is. But then we have to ensure that we have the right people in it. And that's what the senior guardians do. They don't
Right.
rule in this kind of absolutist way. They actually make the whole system work by ensuring that the right people go into the right roles.
Right. There's a whole educational superstructure in order to maintain the values that the system has determined that it wanted. And here's another thing, because it really seems to me that we've run into this again and again, and I'm wondering if Plato had a way of dealing with this. People can say that they're devoted to the ideals of democracy, and you can ask them about it, and they can say, "Oh, yes, yes, I believe, all people are equal, and blah 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 blah," or whatever it happens to be, and they can lie about it. And how do you tell if they really believe what they're saying? I mean, were the tests like, did he account for that in what he was doing, or did he not get to that level of specificity?
So that's where I think that it's very interesting that there's this 15-year period where the test is really this practical test. How are
Okay.
you performing
Okay. All
in
right.
practice in the office, right?
Right.
That's what's being observed. So
Gotcha.
it's really about walking the walk, at that point,
Right.
and not just
Right. So
talking
it's
the
so it's
talk.
so it's ongoing testing at each point, and if you're not living up to those standards, there's like a specific like set of like people examining you like by these pre-established standards in order to make sure you're on the track, and presumably they would have the power to say, well, you're not doing this correctly, you're just self-serving, and they would have the power to take action at that point.
Exactly. And again,
Okay.
I think there are interesting parallels. People have talked to me about parallels, which I think are there to Confucian ideas of meritocracy and so on. One of the things that I think is important about Plato is the standards are pre-established, but
Right.
they're also not sort of purely technical or procedural. So what
Right.
you're always really trying to get at is, are they actually showing that they care in the right way for the right things when
Right.
they're governing, so
Right.
it's not just, it's never box ticking, or that isn't to say that the rot couldn't set in at some point. I mean,
Sure.
actually later in the Republic there is a kind of envisaging of what could eventually go wrong in such a society,
Yeah.
and it would probably eventually start to degenerate and go wrong. So there's, Plato isn't saying this is easy or perfect or
Right.
guaranteed, or it's only as good. And I think it's important to say, like, in defending it,